Hello and welcome to episode 4, Commercial Space and its Impact on Asia. To understand this landscape of commercial space in Asia, we have today with us the subject matter expert, Mr. Blaine Curcio. Hi, Blaine. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Omkar, thanks a lot for having me.
Likewise, thank you very much for joining us. As we'll be taking a deep dive into this topic, can you please provide us a brief outlook of your journey in the space industry?
Sure thing, absolutely. So I've been in the space and the SATCOM sector for a little more than 12 years now. I originally started off as an intern with SES over in their office in The Hague, doing some different market research and some kind of customer analyses back in 2010. After that, I joined Northern Sky Research. It's an industry research and consulting house. I worked for them for a little more than 5 years, primarily focused on the global SATCOM sector. And then a little more than 5 years ago, I started to see an increasing amount of activity coming out of the Chinese commercial space side of things. And in China, one of the relatively few subsectors that is not so dynamic is SATCOM. You have China SATCOM, which still has kind of a monopoly. And so there was not so much overlap between my day job and these China commercial space companies. And so after seeing quite a lot of growth there, I left my role with NSR, started my own company, focusing more on the Chinese commercial space side of things. And then I have since been working with Euroconsult for about 4 years as an affiliate consultant, still primarily focused on global SATCOM with them. So this kind of journey from pure focus on SATCOM to now over these past 5 years, doing kind of 1 foot in the global SATCOM sector, and then 1 foot in the kind of broader Chinese space sector as well. So it's exciting time to have been covering the industry, and looking forward to getting into some of these topics with you today.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very amazing portfolio, I would say, with respect to the niche market. I know that you are a Chinese market expert, especially from the space and satellite perspective, but mainly focused on the satellite communication. So I'm just coming to that part. But I'm very curious to know, like, as a SATCOM expert, having spent so much time in Asia, can you please share with us how you have experienced the evolution of SATCOM technologies in the Asian region?
Sure thing. Yeah. So definitely quite a lot of change happening in the Asian region, over the 12 years or so that I've been covering the sector. And I mean, I think really at a macro level, the biggest change we've seen is that SATCOM is becoming considerably more mainstream. So I mean, I joined the industry back at a time where you were still looking at, a megahertz of satellite capacity might cost $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 per month or more, even for like data type of connectivity. You still see some of those price points in the kind of DTH side of the house. But in general, I mean, 12 years ago, this was the norm, was thousands of dollars per megahertz. And over these 12 years, that has fallen to almost in all cases like hundreds of dollars per megabits per second, and maybe 1,000-ish per megahertz for data connectivity. And I mean, one of the results, but also one of the kind of supporting factors of this has been just enormous increases in the amount of capacity that we see being sold. So I mean, 10, 12 years ago, a large satellite would have been 10 gigabits per second of total throughput. And, the very largest ones in Asia at that time, you'd have had like Thaicom's IP Star, which was very early to the game. And they brought some 30, 40 Gbps of high throughput capacity. And so, again, I think that we've seen over these last 12 years, just this enormous increase in the amount of capacity that's being sold, and again, satellite becoming more mainstream as a result of that. Yeah, so definitely a lot of changes have happened in the industry in Asia Pacific over the course of my 12 years covering the SATCOM sector. And I think at a high level, the biggest change has been just this significant increase in kind of the satellite has become more mainstream, let's say. And this has been caused by a number of different factors, but I think the biggest ones is this advent of high throughput satellites and just much more capacity coming into the market. And as a result, a lot lower price points per megabit per second. So, I mean, thinking back to 12 years ago when I first came into the sector, we were looking at, pricing in the several thousand US dollars per megahertz per month, even for data connectivity. And now you're seeing pricing at, 1,000-ish per megahertz, and you're also seeing more efficient, better spectral efficiency, so more bits per hertz. And so, again, the end result is that you can have programs like in Indonesia, for example, Bakti, which is their universal service obligation program. I mean, they're buying hundreds of gigabits per second of capacity from satellite. Now, a lot of that is domestic, they're getting their own satellites, but it's also presented opportunities for commercial foreign satellite operators to sell 6 or 10 or 15 gigabits per second to a single customer in Indonesia. And again, these are numbers that would have been unfathomable even 10 or 15 years ago. And I mean, just to think about it in a different way, the largest satellite by far in Asia Pacific up until a handful of years ago was Thaicom's IP Star, and that was launched in, I think, 2005 or so. And at that time, it was revolutionary, some 40-ish gigabits per second of high throughput capacity. And now we're seeing terabit per second satellites from Viasat, let's say. So again, I think this just massive increase in the order of magnitude of capacity coming into the market, which has really enabled satellite to serve much bigger applications. And I mean, just one other separate example from Bakti in Indonesia, we've seen pretty large USO programs in Malaysia, for example, that are once again looking at an order of magnitude gigabits per second of capacity, and you're looking at per site throughput of some 10 megahertz or something like that, 30 megabits per second. So just this amount of bandwidth, even in the context of 10 or 15 years ago, I think has been a really major driver of change in the region. And I think there's this potential moving forward for a virtuous cycle where satellite operators keep bringing in considerably more capacity at a lower price point, and countries are becoming more aware of the competitive nature of satellite. And so the countries and the governments are now saying, well, we want to connect our rural populations, and before we wouldn't even think about satellite because it was just totally not cost effective, but now it's a real option. So I think moving forward, you have the potential for this virtuous cycle where there's more government support for satellite that allows satellite operators to invest more into bigger platforms, and that allows for lower price capacity and so on. So this has been, I think, a very big change, and one that we're still watching play out. I mean, the Bakti program in Indonesia, that's only a couple of years in, and they still have multiple satellites in the pipeline, and I mean it has a lot of support. So these are this is a new phenomenon, I would say, these programs that are using tens or hundreds of gigabits per second of capacity.
Wow, that's quite a lot of developments, I would say. And with respect to one of the point that you mentioned at the moment, the competitiveness in the satellite domain. So we have seen like the Asia has been one of the lucrative satellite broadcasting markets. I think with India, along with that, India being one of the hotspot for several companies, including Airtel. So can you tell us about how the region is diversifying its commercial footprint in the satellite sector, like moving apart from the broadcasting, like the market we can see right now, it's transitioning from broadcasting to broadband. So what are your general thoughts on this, like how the market is diversifying?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I mean, to your point, yeah, definitely broadcast has been the bread and butter of the SATCOM industry since the beginning of time, let's say. And so you've seen, as the price of capacity has come down, the pricing for video has remained fairly, stable because you have these long-term contracts, but still it puts pressure on that pricing. And it creates this need for satellite operators and other players in the value chain to diversify. And I think you've seen this in a couple of different ways. So the first point, which you alluded to a little bit with the example in India, I mean, we've seen in say the Philippines, there's Signal TV, which is a DTH platform. They have about 3 million subscribers, if my memory is correct. And they have historically used satellite for direct-to-home broadcast, and as a kind of premium service provider. In the Philippines, there's a lot of free-to-air content, and so the idea of paying, let's say, 60 or 80 US dollars per month for DTH, it's kind of an upper to upper middle class proposition. And Signal, they over the last couple of years have tried to push into satellite broadband. They had, if I'm not wrong, they've invested in an iDirect hub, and they now have more infrastructure available for satellite broadband, and they're trying to push this to, again, what is already an upper to upper middle class consumer in the Philippines. And so I think this really gets back to the point I mentioned earlier of significantly more capacity at a lower price is allowing satellite to do things that they could not previously do. And so I think the first type of diversification is you see these existing, let's say DTH platforms as an example, moving into providing broadband via satellite because they already have some satellite expertise and they already have a pretty good customer base for these satellite programs. The other element I would say is that we're seeing more either diversification by satellite operators into, say, certain service provider type of areas. So this includes things like, AsiaSat has started their SAILAS, SAILAS, I believe, kind of a maritime managed service platform where they're trying to have a more direct connection with, shipping companies to provide maritime SATCOM service. And I think this is, but one example of this trend of satellite operators getting closer to the end customer and trying to sell them what we could call, let's say, managed megabits per second, as opposed to what was more common, say, 10, 15 years ago, which was just sort of raw megahertz being sold to some of these large service providers. So I think those are two examples of diversification, would be the customers like BTH platforms diversifying into consumer broadband or other verticals, and then the satellite operators themselves kind of vertically integrating. The other element I think that's been interesting to see is, these, let's say, mega service providers like your Speedcasts of the world, where they have dramatically increased the amount of bandwidth that they're buying. So there was a press release by Speedcast about 6 weeks ago, let's say, where they talked about they're increasing their network by an additional 13 Gbps of capacity, which was, I think, almost doubling what their total network size. I mean, it was a massive increase in bandwidth. And again, this is primarily driven, in the case of Speedcast, as far as I understand, driven by a strong rebound in the cruise market and also the oil and gas and energy markets, both of which are relatively new in terms of satellite selling very large amounts of bandwidth. Now, satellite has served oil and gas since the beginning of time with relatively low bandwidth services. But we've started to see, as an example, O3B having a trunk at a mine site or something like that, where it could be hundreds of megabits per second at a single site. So yeah, a lot of diversification going on. And I think, from a satellite operator perspective, you do still see a few regional operators that are very focused on broadcast. And even for those operators, that level of focus, and they're trying to come up with, more value added services around the broadcast. I mean, they have, let's say, eroded at a less fast rate than one might expect. So, and I guess just one very last point to tie into my previous answer about these universal service projects. We see the operator MiaSat, for example, in Malaysia. Just last week, they launched their MiaSat 3D satellite, which has about 30 gigabits per second of Ka band capacity. And that's primarily going to be serving universal service and other kind of remote connectivity in Malaysia. So that, MiaSat, having been very much a broadcast-focused satellite operator for a long time, parent company being a large broadcaster in Astro Malaysia, the fact that they are now clearly putting a lot more emphasis on this, high throughput capacity, serving broadband access type of services. This is, I think, an indication of a larger trend, which is, operators throwing up more capacity and then trying to sell that capacity in a managed way.
I think yes, the mobility market, as you mentioned, it's growing, and with respect to the USP, the Universal Service Project, I think we have observed quite a lot of these things in Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as you mentioned, where the government is actually encouraging the private companies to take part and amplify the satellite services, especially in the rural areas. They are trying to come up with such a policy framework where only satellite services can be encouraged. And that's the reason actually I asked this question, because we are observing a trend where broadcasting is transforming into a broadband. So I think we have already reached the niche market point. But just before proceeding ahead to that, I would like to know, just because there are countries like Australia and South Korea building their independent space capabilities. So, how do you see, or I would say, like, can you provide us a brief outlook on commercial space sector of these countries? Because both Australia and South Korea, they are building the independent capacities along with the well-established players like China, India, and Japan. Like Australia also recently approved their own military satellite as well for the communication purposes. So, how do you see, or how do you possibly envision how these countries will take a lead role? Like for example, India is specializing in mainly the launch segment. China is specializing primarily, I would say, investment in the commercial space sector. So how do you envision these two countries proceeding ahead into the future? How these two countries will possibly evolve as a specialized nations in some verticals of the space industry?
Sure. So I think it's an interesting comparison looking at Australia and South Korea compared to, let's say, China or India. I think that if we look at, let's say, China, just to give a very short, I mean, I think China is really focused on developing comprehensive space capabilities, if we can use such a phrase. They have space stations, space exploration, a variety of launch vehicles, different satellite manufacturing capabilities, etc. And if we compare that to, say, Australia or South Korea, these two countries, I think, are a little bit more selective in what they're trying to do. And part of the reason is that they're just smaller countries with relatively smaller economies, and therefore less funding to put into space. But also, I think part of it is pragmatism. I mean, it might not make sense to try to do every single thing. And in the Chinese context, I think you're going to see a lot of inefficiency as China tries to develop these comprehensive space capabilities. So again, getting back to Australia, South Korea, I think Australia is a little bit further along on this journey. Their space agency was started a few years ago, and they've really been pushing this for quite a few years. South Korea, they've had CARI is the Korea Aerospace Research Institute. I mean, they've been around for a long time, but the Korean government and the push into space has been a somewhat more recent phenomenon. I think in both cases, so Australia, South Korea, their space capabilities and kind of the political support for those capabilities, this is being driven by, at least to a certain extent, national security. I mean, obviously, in the case of South Korea, you have the outstanding issues with the North, and I mean that is a serious concern for the South Koreans. And so I could envision there being a pretty significant level of kind of national security consideration going on there. In the case of Australia, to a somewhat lesser extent, but I think that they're finding the neighborhood in which they live is becoming increasingly uncertain, with China being a little bit more assertive in the region. And so I think in both cases, you're going to see security being a major component. I think with Australia as well, you've seen this interesting willingness to experiment a little bit to try to solve some of the specific problems that Australia faces as a country. So the best example that I could think of would be the two NBN, the National Broadband Network satellites. I think Sky Muster is the name they gave those two satellites. And those would have been launched something to the effect of 5 to 7 years ago. And the idea was that you have this national broadband network, which is a primarily terrestrial network of fiber to the home and other technologies that aim to connect all Australians to high-speed internet. And at a certain point, the government said, well, there's going to be a certain percentage of Australians, let's call it 2% or something, that are living so far outside of any kind of terrestrial connectivity that we need to launch these two high throughput satellites. And I mean, that was more than $1 billion US. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but something like 1.6 billion, possibly Australian dollars, sounds vaguely familiar. But digressing, I mean, those two satellites are, as far as I know, not especially highly utilized overall, although they do have certain beams that are very full. And I think overall there has been uptake. But it's an interesting comment on Australia's willingness to experiment a little bit and to try to solve these problems that you could say are perhaps not uniquely Australian, but are certainly more acute in a country that has such a vast and relatively uninhabited interior to be able to try to connect everyone in that area. So I think these are just a couple of high level ideas about Australia, South Korea. I think moving forward, You're going to see, large industrial players in both countries getting more involved. South Korea, we've seen Hanwha start to invest in some flat panel antennas. You've heard rumors about Samsung doing the constellation game for some time. And then in Australia, we've seen Optus, among others, trying to become more involved as kind of a comprehensive sort of space industrial supplier. So yeah, definitely some interesting things going on in those couple of countries you mentioned.
Interesting to know this. So I think like overall, whether it's South Korea, Australia, or India, most of the Asia Pacific region, it's been bound together, with the ocean. So I'm coming to the point of the mobility market. We are looking at the overall market transition, as we mentioned. So do you think mobility market verticals, especially including in-flight connectivity and maritime, there will be a potentially more demand for SATCOM technologies, especially in the Asia Pacific region?
Definitely, yes. So I think when we look at mobility and IFC, and well, let's say mobility in general, IFC maritime specifically, I mean, we're seeing already this lowering cost of satellite capacity and a much larger throughput in any given spot. That's the enabler. So if we look at, as an example, the amount of capacity consumed by cruise ships 15 years ago compared to now, I mean, that number would have increased by, I would venture to say, it could be a factor of 100. If you think about all the gigabits per second that are being sold by O3B and others into cruise ships compared to 15 years ago, it would have been, yeah, could be a factor of 100. On airplanes, I mean, it would be a fairly similar order of magnitude, so dozens of times increase. And I mean, up to now, if we look at the Asia Pacific region and we look at IFC, for example, the penetration rate among airplanes is very low if we compare that to, say, North America. Like in the US, for the domestic fleet of most North American airlines or American airlines, you would have order of magnitude would be 60, 70% or more of these airplanes outfitted with some kind of in-flight connectivity. And if we look at, say, China, it would be less than 10%. And I would venture to say India probably less than 10%, if any, given that I think the regulations remain unclear. And then you look at places like, Japan, probably a little bit higher penetration rate, but in general, there's still a lot of room to grow in the IFC sector in the region. And the question, I think, will be something more like, a lot of these countries, the airlines are, if not outright state owned, they have a certain level of protection, let's say from the government. They have a certain limit to the extent to which they are incentivized to do things that are kind of risky and potentially innovative. So as an example, I remember a few years ago at a Euroconsult event in Paris, they were interviewing an executive from Air China talking about air flight connectivity plans. And this executive was saying, yeah, we're still kind of studying this and it's under review. And maybe in 5 years, we will have in-flight connectivity on our trans-Pacific flights, which is, I mean, it gives an indication, and this is, again, probably 2019. So it gives an indication of the speed of change in some of these companies, but also just the level of conservatism. And so I think when you look at, let's say, Thailand, where, Thai Airways is, I don't know off the top of my head, but I would venture to say it's a little bit state-owned, if not outright, owned by the Thai government. Thai Airways, I suspect, does not have such a huge incentive. There's not a lot of competition, let's say, for the high-end long-haul or even domestic flights within that country. And so whether Thai Airways has such an incentive to outfit their airplanes with what is an objectively kind of risky proposition in terms of finances, and it's an expensive thing, that's a real consideration. I think looking at the maritime sector, somewhat similar, although potentially it's an easier business case in some cases to close, because you have, I think, maritime fleets in the region that are not particularly advanced in terms of their digital infrastructure. And so you could make a pretty compelling case to say, well, if you have a ship and you want to save money by having it be, better optimization of everything going on the ship, or better fuel optimization, or even making it easier to attract employees, because a lot of people now, especially post-COVID, like if you say to them, go work on this ship in the ocean for 6 weeks and have no internet, or like very, very slow internet, that's a non-starter for a lot of people nowadays. I mean, you'd have to pay them a lot more, I would think. Whereas if you say, well, we'll give you internet, like decent internet, you might end up saving money in the long run, because it might be that much easier to attract people to work for you. So again, these are all different for different countries, and obviously the region is very diverse, and there's even differences within these verticals. But I think in general, it's very safe to say that there is a lot of room left to run in the mobility sector in the Asia Pacific region. And I think getting to the last part of your point about, potentially land mobile, kind of either autonomous vehicle, connected cars more generally, we have seen, for example, Geely in China as an automobile manufacturer, they talk about having their own constellation, primarily aimed at like kind of enhanced navigation, so not so much comms, but nonetheless, I suspect at least part of the reason that they would be downplaying the comms element is because communications is a very sensitive industry in China. But I think either way, the point being that there is interest even among the region's auto manufacturers in having a kind of satellite component to what they're doing. So that could also lead to some upside in the kind of land mobile connected vehicle kind of sector in the region.
Yes, I agree with the point that there is a lot of room for innovation, especially like I would like to just share a quick incident. Like while coming, having a flight from Paris to India, I was actually facing this issue that there was no Wi-Fi. Like, we are the India is one of the biggest democratic country, and we are, one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and there is no connectivity. And that was kind of a little bit disappointing. But I was speaking with the people from the airlines when I got down at the airport, just having a general conversation. And it was a good thing to know that that there are some improvisations that are happening on the ground level from the policy framework perspective. So I believe in the aviation sector, I think it's mainly in the hands of the Ministry of Aviation. Once they possibly evolve or improvise their policies, maybe in the future we might see some growth in the IFC segment as well, because I believe if there are people like me, who are at the almost at the decade with the decade of experience, are hungry to work on even on the airplanes, I'm pretty sure there is a lot more population who really want to work while they are traveling as well. But unfortunately, there is no connectivity at the moment for such long flights. So I believe, as you mentioned, there is a lot of space for innovation, and I think there will be more push as we proceed ahead in the industry.
And just out of curiosity, what airline were you taking there from India, from France over to India?
It was Air India.
Air India, okay.
Yes.
Um,
So
yeah,
it was
like
it
I
was
said,
quite nice to see
yeah.
they have improvised a lot as well. Air India, I think, since recently the Tata has taken over. But I'm hopeful the way Tata has, because Tata has also, like, their partner company, or I guess it's the subsidiary Nelco. They have partnered with Telesat as well. So maybe in the future we might see something coming through as a connectivity, medium from Telesat for the in-flight connectivity in the Air India. So there might be a possibility, because I'm not sure how these things will evolve in the future. But as far as I have seen, like the way Tata has built several industries in this country, they have always taken care of, how things will be more friendly towards the people rather than from a business perspective. So I think there might be some change in a year or two, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting perspective, and I mean I suppose there's probably for a separate episode, but maybe today also there's quite a lot to talk about as it relates to the deregulation. Maybe is not the right word, although I think, or changes in regulation in the Indian satcom, and to a certain extent the space sector more generally. It seems like there's the idea of having a Tata type of company. I guess in the case of Air India, it's more aviation, but having a private company coming in and being involved is yeah, that's probably a welcome change, and just creates maybe a little bit more dynamism, or just more kind of competition, as it were. So sounds like there's a lot going on there.
Yes, definitely. So, like coming to the, I think we are reaching the end point of the conversation. So I'd like to know, like, especially with respect to, the business movements in Central Asia as well. So companies like Pacific, they're doing a really good work, especially in the Pacific region. And so with respect to that, what do you think are there any more opportunities for new players to innovate in the Asian region? As well as what are your thoughts about the latest satellite business movements in Central Asia, from especially we have seen Azerbaijan, which is growing, and then Kazakhstan, where SCS is doing a lot of business since past 1 year. So, what are your thoughts on these questions?
Sure. So just I guess to tackle the first part of your question first about companies like Pacific and the innovation that they're doing, and then is there more opportunity in the region for such companies? Yeah, and then I'll get in a moment to the second part of your question about Central Asia. So I think definitely we've seen with Pacific and others, but I think really up to this point primarily Pacific coming into certain markets, typically the Philippines, Indonesia, and bringing Ka band capacity and bringing lower price packages. And this has been, I think uptake thus far has been fairly promising. I mean, you've seen them, Pacific in particular, having a couple of deals in Indonesia, but then also having some distributors in the Philippines that seem to be picking up traction. And we've seen pricing for their plans come down in certain markets. So for example, I was looking at their pricing in the Philippines about a year to maybe 14 to 16 months ago. And the cheapest consumer broadband package was about 140, about 140 US dollars per month, thereabouts. And now, if you look at the cheapest broadband package in the Philippines from Pacific, it's just a bit under 100 US dollars per month, and that's a pretty significant difference if you're if you're say an upper middle class Filipino household, and you could imagine there being some demand elasticity there. So I think overall this has been a very promising development for the industry. This bringing of lower cost consumer broadband type of services, or even let's say village Wi-Fi, if you're looking at even a bigger addressable market. I think moving forward, though, there's a lot of room for more innovation. I mean, when we look at some of the markets in the region, like there's not that much capacity right now. Indonesia has sucked up a huge amount of capacity for Bhakti, and so you could imagine more capacity, and especially on larger satellites, the bandwidth price could be more competitive, or there could just be better service offerings than there are right now. And again, right now, the issue being in some cases insufficient capacity to offer those types of services. So that would be one area. And then I think another area that it's a very hard thing to do, and I don't have a very good answer for how to do it, but how to really expand satellite's footprint to the very furthest reaches. So it's not Asia Pacific, but I was speaking with a friend of mine who is the head of a satellite service provider in Mexico. We're talking about 2 months ago. And my friend was saying that one of the challenges that they face in Mexico when trying to deploy rural Wi-Fi hotspots is cash collection. Like you have customers that are buying prepaid, kind of data, sort of SIM card type things for this hotspot, and they're buying this from local convenience store type of things, and they're paying cash. And then the service provider, they need to find a way to get all of these relatively small banknotes from all of these relatively far-flung regions back to some centralized place, and without having any of that money go missing, or without having any of it get skimmed off the top, or any of these things. And like that's a real challenge in a place like Mexico. And I don't know exactly how that would compare to say the Philippines or Indonesia, but when you look at the per capita income in the latter two countries, it would be lower than Mexico. I don't know how much that would contribute to more or less difficult cash collection, but point being, there is, I think, room to innovate in this sector in ways that are maybe not directly related to this, the satellite side of the business, or the bandwidth side of the business. Things like, if satellite operators really want to connect all of the unconnected in all these remote places in all of these countries, there will be challenges that maybe are not so apparent, like how to collect large amounts of small banknotes from very rural places in the Philippines. And So yeah, I suppose without wanting to use completely meaningless buzz phrases, fintech could be an interesting way to solve that. That has that's such a broad phrase in this context that you can take it for whatever you want it to mean. But I guess point being, yeah, there's a lot of challenges, and the companies that can kind of identify and start to understand and address those challenges, there is still, I think, room to innovate, let's say, and to expand the market. And again, just to wrap up, I think that one clear example of the room for innovation is that we have seen very big satellites launched into the region, and a lot of those satellites have filled up relatively quickly. And so there is apparently, let's say, thirst for bandwidth at a certain price point. And so now, yeah, it's a question of bringing more bandwidth and being more innovative about distributing that bandwidth and collecting the associated fees for the bandwidth.
Yes, definitely. I think there is always a room for innovation, and I believe, like, especially with respect to Central Asia, we haven't recorded a lot more, a commercial footprint from those regions of the world. But I'm glad to see that, like countries like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan as well, growing. And I think that there might be a lot more opportunities, especially because we have seen in countries like Mongolia as well, that there are a lot of remote region, and I think people are still, not very well connected the way they are in the other parts of Asia.
Mm. Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's definitely true. That yeah, there's a lot of unconnected parts of this region still. Yeah.
So, like, moving at the end part of the podcast. So, Blaine, as an industry expert, that too with a more than a decade of experience, what message would you like to give to future generation stepping into the field of space science and technology, and especially for the people who would like to take up, the business vertical or the commercial side of the space industry?
Sure. And I guess maybe just tying this in a little bit to the second half of the last question that I just realized I forgot to address. So, Central Asian countries and kind of what are they doing? So I think in general, we have a lot of government support coming into the sector, and there's going to be a lot of companies that are able to raise money fairly easily from different governments, and also that are able to have kind of a sandbox mode kind of way of experimenting with some of these new technologies. And I suspect a lot of these companies are going to end up doing incredibly innovative things and having a big impact on the industry and on humanity more generally, if we can be so lofty in our ambitions. But a lot of them, I think, are going to be, let's say, not as well managed, not as well thought out. And indeed, I mean, some of the companies that you see today are a little bit, the business model seems a little bit fishy at best when you look at some of the projections. And so as a young person, I think it's important to be discerning, to look at these businesses and to really ask yourself, do I really believe that this makes sense? Because I do think, as when you're in an industry that's in this rapid growth phase and money is just pouring out of the sky and everyone, SPACs every couple of, seems like, although that has died down quite a lot. But point being, there's a lot of easy money coming into the sector right now. Obviously, space remains hard, and it's not everyone gets a large check from a venture capital fund. But in general, be discerning and kind of be aware of what your value proposition is and what you want to do with your career. And I think one of the things to look, these Central Asian countries, for example, you have places like Kazakhstan, which has a very strong space industry heritage. They have a lot of very talented engineers. They have some excellent infrastructure with their Baikonur launch center, but then also some of the companies in Kazakhstan are doing quite a lot. But I suspect that they are having challenges in maintaining talent. I guess a lot of their most talented engineers are potentially looking to go somewhere else to work. And I suspect that there will be a certain level of how would you say, contradiction maybe is not the right word, but there's going to be an inherent kind of tension between countries like Kazakhstan saying, we want to develop our own space sector, or we want to have all these different capabilities, but then at the same time, having a global space industry that is growing, and that is, you have, let's say, Silicon Valley, I presume, is attracting a lot more space industry talent than it was a few years ago, or places like Austin, Texas. So yeah, I think, trying to take a step back, see the industry in a macro perspective, look at some of these companies and say, do I really believe in what they're really trying to do? Because again, some of these companies, they're raising lots of money at valuations that seem to be just completely out of touch with reality in some cases. And really just kind of keeping a critical perspective in a time where there's just a lot of people saying, yes, we want to be in space. So yeah, I think these are important things to consider as a young professional coming into the sector. And then I guess one last point probably would be to network, to try to meet as many people as possible, because we're in an industry that's expanding rapidly. I mean, when I go to space industry conferences now, I see a lot of people that I don't know, and a lot of those people are young, and that's a very good thing to see. But it's also very different from the way the industry used to be, where, the SATCOM sector and the space sector, even more broadly, it used to be, everyone knows everybody kind of a thing. And there are still certain areas, SATCOM is still pretty specific. There's areas that are still like that, but I think as the industry gets bigger, as we get more people coming in, more new people, it's going to be even more important to maintain an active network, and to really to try to meet the newcomers coming into the sector and understand what are some of these new companies trying to do, and just kind of be on top of the sector. So yeah, those would be my two main pieces of advice, I suppose.
Yes, I think I'm pretty sure the people who will be listening to this podcast will, especially the future generation, the students and the research scholars who are trying to enter the space industry, will be walking with the respect to the suggestions that you have mentioned just now. So thank you very much, Blaine, for being available for the podcast and providing us such a valuable insights on the industry, and especially on the Asian space sector. I hope we create one more follow-up episode in the future, because there are a lot of questions that have come up while during being in the conversation, especially in the mobility market segments. So thank you very much again.
Cool. Well, thank you as well, Omkar. It's been good catching up, and I'm glad that we could have this discussion. So definitely happy to catch up again next time. Thank you.